Hello, I'm Léonie Watson, and it's wonderful to be here on part of this event today. So, there we were thinking that PWA stood for Progressive Web App. Well, okay, so it really does. But the question I'd like to know the answer to is, does PWA mean possible with accessibility? The good news is that in at least one respect, the answer is a resounding yes. A PWA is inherently accessible because it's designed to let people consume content on tablet devices, phones, desktops, laptops, and whether they're online or offline. So in the most basic sense of the word accessible, the answer is yes, absolutely. It lets us access content in different places on different devices and different times. And within that, it means that people are going to be interacting with a PWA in different ways. We'll be touching or tapping it, we'll be clicking it or pressing keys. And within that range of interactions, there are two more forms of interaction that you may be a little less familiar with, perhaps. One is voice in. Actually, it's true that these days many of us talk to our devices. We ask them to do things for us. But for people who have mobility disabilities, particularly people with dexterity problems, they will often have voice in as their primary, sometimes even only, form of interaction. So setting up a PWA in ways that support the ability to use it through voice is a really good thing to do. Then, conversely, there's speech out. There are people who prefer to listen to content instead of look at it on screen. People like me who are blind and use a screen reader because we can't see the content. Similarly, people who have low vision might also use a screen reader. Screen readers are also used by people with cognitive disabilities, though. Listening to a single channel, speech out, is often a much better experience than the sometimes very distracting visual experience that you can get with web content. So as well as thinking about the ways people touch and tap and click and key press, think about the ways people will use their voice to instruct your PWA and the people who will listen to the content presented through your PWA using a screen reader and synthetic speech. So where does PWA accessibility begin? Well, where most PWA experiences begin with what appears on the home screen, the way into your web app. And here I'm going to turn to the material design guidelines from Google because they have some really good advice on the size of the icon. MIT Touch Labs did some research and they found that the average size of a fingertip, the thing most of us are probably using to interact with things on our touchscreen devices at least, is somewhere between 8 and 10 millimeters. And so that means that you want to choose an icon to appear on the home screen for your PWA that offers a comfortably large touch target so that people can tap on it quickly and easily without accidentally getting the icon to either side when they didn't really mean to. You can play it safe and follow the material design guidelines, which suggest that if you have a pixel density icon of about 48 by 48, it'll end up giving you a touch target of about 9 millimeters square, no matter what screen size you're talking about. I'd actually suggest being a little bit more energetic about it than that and going for a 54 by 54 because that'll just bump up the touch target size that little bit extra. That means it'll be comfortable even for people who have larger hands, but also for people who have those dexterity problems where tapping is maybe difficult because you have a tremor in the way your hands and fingers move, for example. So yeah, make it easy for someone to get into your PWA is a really good start for the experience. And then we have to think about how the PWA is configured. And that, of course, comes in the form of the web app manifest that we'll be using. And there are a number of different properties within your manifest that have relevance in terms of accessibility. The first is the name of your PWA. Name translates to something in accessibility known as an accessible name. So like this is the name of your PWA. An accessible name is the piece of information that a screen reader will use to tell someone who can't see the screen which app they're about to interact with. It's also the name that someone using voice in or speech recognition will use to instruct their device to open it. So keeping it short and sweet and easily memorable is a really good idea for accessibility best practice. Here, I've imagined a progressive web app of my own website, and I've just kept it to tink.uk. And this means that a screen reader might say something like this.
Tink.uk.
A second and closely related piece of information is another property in your manifest called description. This translates to a secondary piece of accessibility information known as accessible description, and it works in partnership with the name or accessible name. A description, like it does in your manifest, provides an extra bit of information about the app to help people understand what it's for or what they're going to get out of it. And it does exactly the same thing, particularly for screen reader users. If it's available, the description will be read by screen readers just a beat after the name of the PWA, like this.
Tink.uk. Léonie Woodson on technology, food, and life in the digital age.
So those two pieces of information team up to help everybody understand what your PWA is and what it's going to deliver when someone uses it. The lang property is an interesting one. In theory, what it ought to do is let us set the language of the spoken content of things like your name and description. And this should mean that screen readers pay attention to the language that's been set and adapt the way they sound accordingly. I say in theory because right now it's uncertain quite how well supported this property is in manifest terms in browsers. And so we're not quite sure how well screen readers are going to support it equally. But if I were to give you this example of some French text, first with a screen reader saying it without the benefit of a lang attribute and then with, you'll be able to hear the difference really clearly.
Plus ça change, plus c'est la même chose.
Plus ça change, plus c'est la même chose.
And that's the same screen reader in the same breath, if you will, reading exactly the same piece of content. But the only difference between the two parts of the example is that the second half had the French language code set and the first one didn't. So hopefully we'll see that one come to fruition more as time goes by. Another property in your manifest is orientation. You can give it properties that include any, natural, portrait, and landscape. And in accessibility terms, I want to caution you against setting either portrait or landscape unless it's absolutely critical to the functionality of your PWA. And the reason is that people who use a wheelchair will sometimes have their touchscreen devices, phone or tablet, fixed to their wheelchair and fixed in a permanent position. That means they're not able to swivel it around to change their device orientation based on the orientation you've chosen for your progressive web app. And so, of course, if their device happens to be set to landscape and you've insisted that your PWA needs to be looked at in portrait, something's not going to work out for one or other or both of you. So if you can, leave it to the user to choose how and which orientation they choose to look at your content in, and don't constrain them unless, as I said, it's absolutely vital to the functionality that you do look at it in a particular orientation. Shortcuts offers us some good usability for everybody, the ability to go to a particular part of your PWA using a shortcut. And here, as before, it's the description that's interesting because it too will be exposed to things like screen readers. So choosing a very short and useful description of what your shortcut will do will be very, very helpful to everybody, but especially people who are unable to see the screen. And a few thoughtful shortcuts will, of course, make things more usable for people who find different forms of interaction more difficult. So, for example, if you can instruct your PWA to go somewhere by voice, that's going to help people with dexterity and mobility disabilities. There's one feature that comes with a big warning sign attached to it because it's still speculative, but I'm very optimistic that it will actually become part of Manifest that we can use, and that's the idea of user preferences. It was an idea suggested by Jen Simmons, and it's had a lot of discussion by the people who are working on Web App Manifest at W3C. And what's on screen now seems to be the idea that everybody is kind of coalescing on agreement with. But the idea is that we can define things for user preferences, like in the example on screen, the difference between light mode and dark mode. A choice that actually in accessibility terms has been advocated for 2 decades or more, but has recently become much more prevalent and much more mainstream. And if this idea goes ahead, it's quite possible that there are other user preferences that could be added to this, looking at things like prefers reduced animation, for example, or prefers certain color combinations other than light and dark mode. So like I say, at the moment, this one is for the future, although it's looking really likely, but it's one I really do hope comes to fruition because it'll make a big difference in accessibility terms. Having looked at the home screen and the entryway into the PWA and the way it's configured through the manifest, what remains really is the experience that the app itself offers people. And we can learn a lot from the inclusive design principles. So I'm going to offer you 7 ideas, 7 principles for ways to think about making your PWA itself, its content, more accessible and inclusive. The first is to offer a comparable experience. Of course, at their very heart, PWA are all about responsive views, letting people consume the content in different ways and on different platforms. And that often means rearranging and reconstructing the content to suit the particular interface or device that it's being consumed on at the time. From an accessibility point of view, one of the things I see most often that causes a lack of comparable experience is when content has been rearranged or hidden to suit the simplified, smaller interface for some screens. And it's been hidden visually, but not from everybody else. Navigation is one of the most common culprits for this. It's one of the features of a page that most often gets rearranged, often down to a hamburger menu, for example, on a smaller screen size. But what happens is that the form of navigation that's not currently in use gets hidden visually. But if you're a sighted keyboard user, you can still tab through both sets of the navigation. And if you're a screen reader user, you can still access the HTML that tells you that there are 2 lots of navigation there. And so the experience is definitely not comparable. It's a lot more cluttered and confusing if you happen to be a sighted keyboard user or a screen reader user. So something as simple as making sure you hide things properly using display none in your CSS or even the HTML hidden property so that everybody gets a comparable experience is a good move to make. Remember that people use your interfaces, your PWA, in different situations. Like we said before, it's at the very heart of what makes them incredibly accessible. But it does also mean that people are going to be consuming your content in very widely different situations. It might be something like making sure that in smaller screen sizes, you're using colors that have that extra little bit of contrast against their backgrounds. Use perhaps a slightly more generous text size so that your content is more easily readable when someone's out in bright sunshine or when it's raining, perhaps. It might mean similarly at smaller screen sizes, if you've got multimedia content, turning captions on by default on the understanding that someone using a mobile device might well be out and about in company, and distracting people with the sound playing might not be the most courteous experience you could offer them. It also, of course, means a good experience for people who have partial sight and need extra color contrast, people who are deaf or hard of hearing and like captions on multimedia content. Use familiar conventions and apply them consistently. This one's an interesting one because in a lot of respects, the idea of a PWA is to behave very much like a native app, only with all the benefits of open web standards and technologies. From a user point of view, though, a lot of people's expectations will be based on their experiences of using native apps. So again, looking to those platforms, those libraries, those components and controls, and reflecting them back in terms of our PWA design and interface is a good idea. Using the conventions that people will be familiar with. None of us like having to learn new processes or figure out how to use different kinds of controls, and particularly for people with cognitive disabilities, short-term memory problems, having to learn processes can be much more difficult than for the rest of us. So keep things consistent, keep them familiar, and it's a good experience for everyone. Give people control. Make sure that people are in control of the way they consume content. One of the ways we can do this is make sure that it looks good and functions well, even at maximum zoom. And by maximum, I'm talking 200% or more. Actually, for most of us who have skipped past the age of 40 mumble something now, having the ability to zoom in a little, pinch to zoom on a touchscreen device is a good thing to be able to do. It's helpful for all of us. But again, for people who have low vision, partial sight, it's going to make all the difference. So check your content at maximum zoom and make sure that nothing disappears, gets overlapped or scrunched up or bunched up and looking ugly, that it's all clean and simple and available. Consider giving people a choice about how they do things, especially things that are non-standard. This often comes back to the idea of having to rearrange and reconstruct your content for different screen sizes and responsive views. Tables, for example, when they're built properly, are really usable for people like me who use a screen reader, but on smaller screen sizes, much less so. The catch, of course, is that screen readers depend entirely on the HTML. So just changing the way something looks using styling and CSS is not going to cut it when it comes to a screen reader experience. So thinking about the choices and the way you're offering the choices of how content is presented is really critical to good accessible experience. Help prioritize content. Let people focus on the things that they want to get done when they're using your PWA. On a conventional web page at normal screen sizes, more often than not, the navigation appears somewhere at the top. People want to get to a website and start navigating around as a rule. On smaller screen sizes, it might mean actually putting the navigation at both the top and the bottom, because that's the place where people tend to go for the content they most quickly want to interact with. Similarly, if your content is all about an article or a news item that you want someone to read, maybe think about minimizing the amount of other content that's available at the top of the screen and plunging straight into the bit that people are most likely going to want to prioritize in terms of their experience. And then consider the value and ways you can offer more value. This one is really a chance to get creative with accessibility and inclusive design. Have a look at the APIs, platform level, web standards that are available that can help you really enhance the experience. So, for example, if your PWA wants someone to enter their address of their current location, maybe thinking about asking the user if they're okay for their current location to be used and auto-populating that address. It's nice and handy for all of us, but particularly for people who find difficulty typing or entering long forms of data, it can make the experience just that bit more accessible. Push notifications are another area, making sure that you've used platform APIs or other APIs to make sure that a push notification is brought to the attention of someone who can't hear the ding that happens when a push notification comes through, maybe using some form of vibration. Similarly, if you can't see the push notification appear, making sure that you use something like a live region in ARIA so that a screen reader user is aware that the notification has appeared too. Getting creative about ways to add value to the experience. So to answer my original question, does PWA stand for possible with accessibility? The answer is yes, absolutely, in lots of different ways. Like much else when it comes to accessibility, there's a little bit of hard work that we need to do as authors and designers and developers. But with a little bit of thought and a little bit of consideration, a PWA can offer a really accessible, in every sense of the word, experience. Thank you.